Every so often, a movie comes along that not only catches the zeitgeist of its contemporary era, but also goes on to influence modern media well after release, as a result, essentially becoming timeless classics. This week's film, 1979's The Warriors, is one such film, having caught the very essence of the late 70s youth counterculture and inspiring films such as John Wick 4, even now.
Warriors, come out to play! Warriors, come out to play! Warriors, come out to play!
The plot is a simple one, essentially a One Fateful Night yarn based on a 1965 Saul Ulrich book of the same name, which in turn was based on the ancient Greek Xenophon's Anabasis. A fateful night where the Warriors, Coney Island's greatest gang, head north to the Bronx. Dressed proudly in their colours, maroon vests emblazoned with their crest, to attend a conclave of all the New York gangs to hear Cyrus and his plan to unite them with the aim of taking control of the whole of the 5 boroughs. Only one problem: the unhinged leader of the rogues assassinates Cyrus and pins the blame on the Warriors, meaning they have to flee for their lives across the entire stretch of the hostile concrete jungle that is New York, to reach the safety of Coney Island, fighting every inch of the way. The plot really is that simple on the surface, but has so many stylistic and countercultural layers to it that resonated with audiences on release and continue to resonate even today, turning it into a stone-cold cult classic.
Can you dig it? Can you dig it?
One of the main reasons that The Warriors resonated so well at the time of its release is that New York was a very different city to the one it is today. It was a city oozing with crime, prostitution and drugs, where gangs ran rampant and the police were fighting a losing war against crime. This reality is reimagined by Hill as a kitsch, highly stylized, almost comic book, youth-fueled dystopian future, populated by various gangs who all dress in the same costumes, act alike and control their various turfs with extreme prejudice. The gangs in The Warriors are all young, hip, street smart and stylish, running the gambit from neo-Nazi Huns to vaudevillian baseball clowns and everything in between, and as a result are incredibly memorable. Yeah, the costumes are kitsch as all hell, and I'd argue, if you made this now, most audiences would reject the very concept of the gangs as being, well, a little bit silly. But here they work, not least because the outlandish uniformity of style and thought is exactly how old people viewed the countercultural youth movements of the 70s. They essentially viewed the youths involved in the 70s counterculture as dangerous costumed gangs. Added to this is the fact this film has a whole lot of heart and social commentary going on, such as when Swan, a member and temporary war chief of the Warriors, and Mercy, a member of a minor gang called the Orphans, who decides to run with the Warriors to escape the downbeat drudgery of her life, come across 4 middle-class high school prom kids on the night train. Initially, the prom kids have a carefree, joyful air about them until they see the unkempt and dirty Swan and Mercy, their faces instantly turning to unhidden disgust. A disgust that Mercy tries to placate by straightening her hair. Swan stares stoically at them and stops her from doing so. I don't think there has ever been a more fitting depiction of the class divide in cinema before or since. Another reason the kitsch, almost cartoon-like costumes work is because they act as direct contrast to New York City. The city is as much a character and part of this film's style and success as any of the humans within it are, cloaked in perpetual darkness. It is dark, dank and dripping with decay. The trains are covered in graffiti, and the streets are dimly lit and foreboding. It's a kind of cinematography I love, where scenes are seemingly lit in a naturalistic way with street and ambient lighting used to highlight characters and certain objects within the frame. They even went as far as to include a rainstorm earlier in the film, so that they could wet down the streets and get even better lighting effects that just wouldn't have been possible on dry surfaces. The combination of location shooting and lighting give every scene a realistic, natural feel that you just don't get with many modern films that are shot in warehouses on green screens, and as a result have to be harshly lit by 1,000 lights. This film only used one set, and that was for the brawl in the toilets. Every other scene was shot on location, and it gives the film a vibrancy and life that is just impossible to recreate via sets and CGI. This backdrop also creates a constant air of menace, and frequently this menace breaks out into outright violence, which, unusually for a movie from the 70s, is physical violence using fists and blunt force weapons. Rather than gun violence, there's only one fatal shooting in the whole 92-minute runtime. The rest of the violence, liberally spread throughout, is visceral, mano a mano machismo, where young men beat the ever-loving shit out of each other with their fists and whatever weapons they can get their hands on, and oh my god, it is glorious. This violence resonated so well with the youths and gangs of the late 70s, its release was linked to at least 3 real-life murders, 2 in California and 1 in Boston. As a result, Paramount were forced to remove all advertisements, theatres were released from contractual obligations to actually even show the film, and a further 200 cinemas hired security to try and keep patrons safe during showings. Hill, the director, has said about the incidents, "I think the reason why there were some violent incidents is really very simple. The movie was very popular with street gangs, especially young men, a lot of whom had very strong feelings about each other, and suddenly they all went to the movies together. They looked across the aisle and there were the guys they didn't like, so there were a lot of incidents."
Can you count, suckers? I say the future is ours! If you can count.
In spite of all of the above, the film received absolute derision from contemporary critics who highlighted its dialogue as being stilted and its depiction of New York and the gangs as being grossly unrealistic, which just goes to show how professional critics have been absolute clueless hacks for decades at this point. Because yes, although those are legitimate criticisms of this film, they are criticisms that miss the point entirely. The style, dialogue and depiction of the gangs are something that Gene Siskel never was, and that is cool. Because yeah, there are loads of plot holes, the costumed gangs make no sense, the dialogue is weird at times, and the acting is sometimes pretty bad, but none of that matters because the rule of cool is in full effect, and the counterculture punk style this film oozes is inherently cool and highly entertaining. So much so that this film has gone on to influence a whole bunch of films long after its release.
I'll shove that bat up your ass and turn you into a popsicle.
Until just now, I had never actually seen The Warriors the whole way through, and I owned and watched the 2005 director's cut rather than the theatrical cut. This adds in a whole bunch of comic book style transitions that Hill allegedly wanted in the original film, but due to time constraints and studio interference didn't make it into the theatrical cut. I of course didn't know this whilst watching the film, and thought these were kind of revolutionary for the time period, as something I've seen in many films since, even if they are seemingly an unpopular addition if online discourse is to be believed. The style of this film, however, is definitely front and centre in another of Hill's films that I reviewed a few years ago, Streets of Fire, a film that combines neo-noir, comic books and musicals and very much looks and feels like a higher budgeted version of The Warriors in many ways.
Shit, the chicks are packed! The chicks are packed!
But the film that I saw recently and instantly recognised as being inspired by this film is John Wick 4. That film's style, use of real-life locations, music and stylized violence is very reminiscent of this movie. One of my favourite things about John Wick 4 was the cinematography and use of lighting. A use of lighting that I think is very reminiscent of The Warriors, with ambient and background lighting being used to give scenes depth and visual interest. John Wick also has highly stylized violence with gangs who dress and act a certain way, much like this film and its use of gangs who all have their own way of dressing and fighting. Of course, a major difference here being that John Wick features the heavy use of guns, whereas The Warriors relies mainly on fisticuffs. The other thing that I think is a possible parallel is the use of real-life locations as gauntlets that John Wick has to fight his way through. In The Warriors, it's the 5 boroughs of New York that act as the deadly gauntlet our protagonists have to run. In John Wick, it is a jet-setting bevy of locations, but every time these locations are almost characters within the film, much like New York, that must be defeated. The use of music within John Wick 4 is the most obvious inspiration, as they literally shot for shot recreate the DJ who gives the rival gangs instructions and plays tunes as the violence happens. And yes, much like John Wick, The Warriors has a banging soundtrack that perfectly complements the on-screen action. As I've said before, I know nothing about music, but I know when I like a soundtrack, and I liked this one. Well, that's all I've got to say about The Warriors. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, like it. If you didn't like it, dislike it. And maybe even think about leaving a comment and subscribing.